Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Thursday wine meditation. Uh, I might look like I'm a little on edge, and part of it is we've just been very busy this week. So this will be my last tasting before harvest starts to get busy. And so I am really excited to share a couple wines with you guys. And we're hoping to do some live stuff from the crush pad. So you can kind of see fruit in action, us crushing grapes, and you'll get to see some behind the scenes experience during harvest. I'm not sure when we will do those. You have to read your emails and pay attention to Facebook because obviously, I can't predict when we'll be picking. That's a decision that's made on a day-by-day basis, and it's very fluid. So we will let you guys know when we can do some live behind-the-scenes stuff. So here we are in September 10th. Let me give you guys a little insight into where we are in the harvest process, and just a little catch up because you are probably have seen some news on the fires. And I want to comfort everyone and let you guys know everybody's safe and everybody's okay, and our property is okay. The fires were not close to us the way they were in 17, although there are several fires in the Northern California area, and even in Oregon. So we've definitely had some funky skies and some interesting air quality, to say the least. But nothing that we haven't weathered before. So at this point, all's going well with harvest. We harvested our whites in late August. So August 24th, we brought in our Sauvignon Blanc and our Sauvignon Gris. And those fermentations are actually almost finishing up, and they're smelling beautiful in the cellar. Very excited. And now, this is not uncommon in harvest, that there's a little bit of a hiatus almost before we start to pick our next grape. And our next grape will be our Hillside Merlot. That's usually the first block to come in. And I think that we're about a week out. That's what I'm going to say. But it's, again, a fluid situation, tasting a lot of grapes right now. I spend my mornings pretty much tasting grapes, walking vineyards, and seeing where we're at. And we look at a lot of data because we have a lot of prior experience here, right? We've been making wine on this ranch now this will be the 37th vintage, Jimmy Rock. And so it's great that we can look at data, weather data, and compare what it is now. And so one of the measurements we use is something called growing degree days, which is sort of it's kind of accumulation of heat over the course of the growing season. And you can compare where we are on this day compared to other vintages. And so today I just did that. I just looking at numbers, and it's quite similar to 2017 as far as growing degree days. So that could mean that our picking dates will be about the same, but it's not always that simple. So we've had a couple of heat spikes, and heat spikes can often kind of slow the ripening process. Now, even though you think heat will make you ripen, if it gets too hot, the vines actually kind of hold back and don't do a lot of activity. They kind of reduce their activity. It's kind of like us in the heat, right? Don't really want to move around. And grapevines very much do the same thing. When you get above 100 degrees, they kind of shut down. Fortunately, I would say there were relatively early season heat spikes. So at this stage, grapes are really good and resilient at bouncing right back. But I think even though in 17 I picked Merlot this week, Merlot's not quite ready. And I think part of it was this year we've had 2 of those heat spikes, and back in 17 we only had 1. So kind of gives you an idea of all the things that we're looking at, in addition to tasting grapes, to kind of decide when we're going to start. But I think I definitely feel adrenaline pumping through. And for a while I thought I was being very brave and saying, I think maybe we could do these tastings during harvest. And then I suddenly went, no, I really need to focus. So you'll miss me here, but we're going to find some other fun substitute activities so you guys can be a part of the process with us a little bit. So hopefully we'll have some Merlot on the crush pad by next week. We'll see. We have a really beautiful week of weather ahead. So nice, even ripening weather, 80s to mid 80s, which will be great after those heat spikes, so that the grapevines can kind of readapt and come back to and continue their ripening process. So with that, what are we tasting today? So fun tasting. We're going to do 2 of our single vineyard Cabernets today from 2014. The clone wines. Now, both of these blocks actually have names that we refer to here inside. So the Clone 4 comes from our Kairos vineyard, which we started making this wine in 2006, was the first vintage. And we named it Kairos for a few years, and unfortunately somebody had taken the name for a label. And so we had to re-baptize the wine, and it's now named after the clone that it's planted to. Clone 7 comes from our Cardiac Hill block, so it's the steepest hillside on the north end of the estate. It's one of the warmest spots on our estate, so very close to the Palisades. Gets a lot of reflective heat from that bedrock and from those massive rock outcroppings, so you're really getting, I think in some ways, a more typical jammy Napa Valley ripe character than you might get from some of our other blocks at the south end, like Alpine or Tomahawk. What's sort of fun about this is, what does a clone mean? It's basically kind of a genetic family, and I don't love the term clone because it implies some kind of genetic cloning or GMO, which this is not. I want to make sure you guys know that. These are propagated like normal plants. There's no genetic manipulation. It's just a family of plants that came from a particular area. And over time, winemakers and vintners will favor a certain clone because they might have characteristics that make great wine. So in describing clone 4 versus clone 7, things can be as different as the way the cluster is shaped. So in the clone 4 grape cluster, they're much looser clusters. They tend not to be filled out or big clusters. They tend to be very small berried. Clone 7 tends to be a slightly bigger cluster, although it's small berried and it's grown on a hillside here, so it's particularly small. They may have different ripening times, so having diverse clones within your estate will give you, means that stuff doesn't all ripen at the same time, and that's sometimes part of the microclimate that you're in, so whether you're in the north or the middle or the south of the property, but also the clone and where that family came from. So the clone 4 is a Bordeaux clone. I believe the clone 7, I think it's thought that it came from the south of France, so a slightly warmer area, and actually the clone 7 tends to ripen sooner here. Not only because it's in a warm spot, but I think there's a little predisposition of the clone to be early ripening. So we'll talk about vintage a little bit. What's kind of neat about these wines is, they're 100% Cabernet from spots that are, the Clone 4 is when you drive into our property, it's the block that's just north of the driveway. Clone 7 is a straight line up, just heading up to the hill. So they're very close to each other. I'll tell you about the sites a little bit. The Clone 4 is grown on what you would look at and say that's Valley 4, but what's interesting about it is it has a very shallow hardpan that's just about 3 feet down. And so the block sort of behaves like a hillside. The roots can't really go very deep because of that hardpan. And so it's basically Valley 4 that behaves like a hillside. A hillside is different because it has shallow soils, and this, because of that hardpan, kind of behaves like shallow soils. It's very small berried, lots of concentration there. And the Clone 7 is that hillside, and it is shallower at the top, sort of middle depth in the middle of the hill, and then the bottom is a little deeper. And we did something really interesting on that block that has made it, I think, particularly good. You plant the size of the plant based on the depth of the soil. So the top, where the soils are shallow, we plant these small plants. They're about 4 feet. In the middle, where the soils are a little deeper, you go 6 feet. At the bottom, they're 8. So they're all planted to different sizes, but basically it ripens evenly because it's proportionate to the depth of the soil. So it's, I think, a great example of how much thought goes into planting a vineyard to get uniformity if you have some of those differences. We'll talk about vintage a little bit. I think what's also great about comparing these wines is that they're made in the same way, just Cabernet from a different area. And the differences that you're going to see are going to be mostly about those different areas. From a winemaking standpoint, they both get about 70% new oak. So these are sort of big Cabernets that can handle quite a bit of new French oak. I use different coopers for them, and that's something that we work here at Chimney Rock, is to really fine tune like which coopers go best with each wine. So, little note on the vintage. I think we've tasted quite a few 14s over the course of these tastings, but the 14 was the second of 3 drought years. So another one of my famous lazy winemaker vintages. Mother Nature just gave us really beautiful dry spring, dry summer, no water in the soil, so early ripening, very small berried, lots of concentration. When I compare 13 and 14, 15, and I like to talk about them kind of in the same vein, 13 is very muscly and more powerful, and 14 is a little bit, it was probably the most approachable of the 3 vintages, even at a young age. So I think the wines are a little bit more graceful even for a drought year. Clone 4 to me, I'm gonna say what I think they're gonna show, and then we're gonna see if they show that. Clone 4 tends to show a lot more black fruit, so a lot of blackberry, real dark fruit. Clone 7 is brighter red fruit, more jammy, more kind of strawberry plums, just a very different kind of fruit profile. So with that, these are Cabernets definitely for the purist. You know, there's nothing else blended in but these blocks. And the first Clone 7 that we made, by the way, was 2005. So first vintage 2006 on the Clone 4, and the Clone 7 was 2005. So, I mean, I kind of know these wines, but there it is, blackberry, lots of dark fruit, real black currant, a lot of cocoa here. There's some really pretty, like, dusty, you know, cocoa powder, some vanilla. That's a little bit of the effect of the oak for sure, that spice from the oak, from the French oak. Not much of the dried herb character that we sometimes see in our wines. I think this is more pure fruit, very focused, and then just some of those, you know, subtle barrel notes. And on the palate, fairly smooth. I mean, this is a 6-year-old cab. And this is definitely one of our most muscular blocks in terms of structure. But this 6 years starting to get a little bit more supple, and really shows a smoothness and a fruitiness. I think the fruit is very visible on the palate as well. It's just sort of jammy, fruity, very typical of that year. Really, really approachable. But, you know, if you go back to it, the tannin is still there, right? There's, this is a great wine to decant. Both of these wines, actually, I really love decanting for an hour or two, let them breathe and sort of come around, because they're still quite youthful. And these are definitely wines, you know, they're wines that you want with a meal. They have a lot of structure. You're going to see them change a lot throughout a meal, so having the two and sitting them side by side and enjoying it. and definitely more of a cherry kind of tone to the fruit. See a lot of cherry. Checking out who's here. Courtney Hill. Hi, Courtney. Carrie Lucas. Hi, Carrie. Yeah, so that Clone 7 really has like it's like a red licorice character too. A little bit of a red licorice, black cherry, bean cherry, like bright. A little bit of plummy. And here I get a little bit of what's the word that I want to use? It's a spice, and it's almost like clove, maybe. So a little bit of clove, and that's again my barrel character that's coming through. A little bit of vanilla. I feel like the oak character is showing a little bit less in this wine than the first one. I'm seeing more of the fruit. So interesting to taste these side by side. Clone 4 to me is a little bit austere on the palate, still holding back. The Clone 7 really coats your palate. It's much lusher, riper. That's a little bit of a characteristic, I would say, of that hillside. It's just jammier, and I would say it's typical of that site. I'm being directed. Thank you, Hannah. The glass was covering my face. Anyway, I think the Clone 7 is really beautiful right now. It's very lush. It's very generous. The Clone 4 is a little bit more restrained. I really love the contrast. What's interesting to me about tasting these right now is if I were to taste these blind, I might guess that the Clone 4 was actually the hillside. Because the tannin is it's just not as generous. It's not as, the mid palate's not as lush. And you think of hillsides as more austere. So that really kind of shows you how that site where the Clone 4 is planted can play tricks on us. So it's sort of fascinating. I would love to hear some comments. Let's talk about winemaking a little bit and how we made these wines so that you guys have an idea. Some of you may know already if you've been to all of our tastings, but I think it's just a good refresher. So all of our fruits handpicked at night, plus it's harvest, so try to give us some refreshers on harvest. Everything's handpicked at night. Right now is about that time of the year when we are walking these blocks every day. We go out with our little Ziploc baggies and we pull berry samples. We taste a lot of fruit, and we bring that sample back to the lab, and we look at things like Brix, which is a measure of sugar. We look at pH. We look at titratable acidity, which is kind of a measure of all the different organic acids that are in wine. And those numbers really don't tell us when to pick, but they're sort of a guideline of where the grapes may be in process. Because ultimately, with Cabernet, what you really look at is the ripeness of the skins. So you have to chew on those skins. The core of the tannin is concentrated in the skins and the seeds of red wine. And so the seeds are really important. So seeds go from being bright fluorescent green to when they're ripe, they turn almost, they polymerize and they look brown like toasted almonds almost. So that's the transition we look for in the seeds. And you don't even need to chew on the seeds. You kind of know when they're green and fluorescent, you don't want to chew on them because it's super bitter. But as they ripen, they really literally start to taste kind of like toasted almonds or roasted almonds. The skins, a little bit different. We look for how quickly the pulp detaches from the skin and from the seeds. So the riper it is, the quicker that pulp in the center detaches. And we also look at sort of the finish on the tannins. Are they green? How persistent? And that perception sort of softens as the grapes ripen. So we pick the grapes. We've decided they're ready. We pick them at night. They get destemmed. So we take the stems off. We put them through a destemmer, which is basically a machine that has these fingers and it kind of moves the clusters back and forth and very gently shakes the berries off. We don't crush our berries, so those berries fall through the bottom of the destemmer. They go straight into a little sump, and we pump this basically fruit and juice together, which is called must, through a 4-inch hose, like a really thick hose, and you don't even break the berries. Like the berries are kind of going whole along with whatever juice may come out, and they go into tanks. So typically we then we may do a cold soak, which means we bring the temperature down to about 50 degrees and let those grapes sit on the skins for a few days. Or we may just start fermentation right away. That decision is based year by year, style of the wine, ripeness of the seeds and skins. But a cold soak is a way of extracting some fruit flavors early on and color before you have alcohol in the mix. Because alcohol changes what you extract, right? So let's say we inoculate, so we add our yeast right on the first day. Typically the primary fermentation will take about 2 weeks, and then we go into what I call magic making time. So after day 14 is when these fermentations really start to show their character to me, and we do what we call extended maceration, which means when that primary fermentation finishes, we stay on the skins longer. So we do extended maceration all the way up to 40 days total time on the skins. And I feel like a lot of the texture and the richness and the mid-palate really is extracted in that time. During that time, what are we doing? We might add some nutrient to help the yeast finish the fermentation. As the yeast consume sugar and produce alcohol, the environment becomes more stressful to the yeast, and so you have to help them along a little bit. And they'll eventually die out once all the sugar is consumed, and alcohol can actually, strangely, be toxic to yeast. So they eventually die out because of alcohol presence, but if you manage your fermentation well, not before they finish processing the sugar, so that's important. And then at that point, after about day, I'm going to say 16 to 18, we will start to taste every tank every day. Every tank every day. It's a terrible job. Somebody has to do it, and that happens to be Laura and I. And that's really when you watch the development of that body and our decision of when to take that juice, that wine. Now it's wine, right after primary, you've got alcohol. There's no more sugar. You are really going to look for the development and the balance of the texture. And the decision of when to take the juice off the skins or the wine off the skins is really based on taste. And we literally will save samples from the prior day and compare so we can see a before and after. And finally that magical day arrives and we say, okay, that is beautiful. We've done it again. And so we drain off the free run, off the skins. That gets drained overnight into, well, first a sump and then to another tank or to barrels. And then the skins that are left behind, so that first fraction is called free run. And here at Chimney Rock, we only use free run in our wines. So these wines are 100% free run. Then we've got skins left in that tank. We take those skins, we actually physically shovel them out, and we press them in a big cylindrical press. That basically yields another 25 gallons to every ton of skins of like a second tier juice, which is called press wine. And here at Chimney Rock, we don't use that in our wines. That's sort of it's a gift of really, aiming to provide like purity and quality, and not to say that press wine is always bad and that you couldn't back blend a little bit in. Some winemakers find that a strength. But in our sort of quest for purity and like showcasing what Stag's Leap District is, and a lot of experimentation, this has been kind of the method we've arrived at. And that may go into other projects, or we may sell them in the bulk market, whatever the opportunities are. So at that point, our free run goes to age in barrel, and we're 18 months in barrel. And that's where the second part of the magic happens, because a barrel does more than just add these beautiful aromatics. in barrel aging, you get this exchange of oxygen through the staves of the wood, and that oxygen has the effect of slowly changing the conformation of these tannins and these phenolics and making them more supple. So wine, Cabernet in particular, needs this so that it can evolve and become sort of more palatable. Young Cabernet can be quite austere and tannic. So that's basically going to change the way things age. And then after 18 months, we'll put it in bottle. And most of these wines, I think our clone wines, we tend to barrel age for around a year before release. Because they're not blended with anything else, they're big wines and they really need some time in aging. So it's sort of a summary of how we made both of these wines. And I would love to see if we have anybody who's tasting both and if their preferences, or do we have some questions? Okay, I've got David Hamrick. Your thoughts on potential useful cellaring times for both wines. Vince Conti, hello. Hello, Vince. I know I think you're in New Jersey. Anyway, so aging for both of these, I think pretty similar. It's interesting because they're drinking differently right now. And right now, I would almost say hold your clone 4, drink your clone 7. If you love kind of the jammy aspect of these younger wines, again, I think that's a personal decision. Like, drink them while they're jammy. But these wines have the structure to go 20 years if you have that patience. 10 years, to me, I think a really sweet spot for a Cabernet that's structured from a grade AVA is there's a really beautiful juncture between like 8 to 12 years where you still have some of the primary fruit, but you're getting some of those secondary aromatics as well. And I think for a lot of us, wine really starts to become fascinating when it evolves into age, that something can be 12 or 15 years old and be so beautiful. And that transformation, those changes as it age, are fascinating. So I'm going to hand out my usual homework for aging Cabernet question, which is buy a case of your favorite Cabernet, which should be Chimney Rock, of course, and drink a bottle of that same vintage with the same friends year after year, and take notes and like find out with that group of friends, like who likes it when it's younger, who loves it. So it's a 12-year-old homework. It's long homework, but it's a really great way to sort of discover what is your sweet spot for enjoying fine Cabernet. And obviously different varieties behave differently. So, Pinot Noir, I might play a totally different game. But with Cabernet, most well-made Cabernet is going to live 12 to 20, and these up to 25 and even 30 years. I've tasted some of our first vintages of Cabernet, and they're still really drinking beautifully. They're very different. A Cabernet of 35 years doesn't show a lot of fruit. It's more ethereal. You're mostly in tertiary aromatics. They're super lean and like silky by then. But I think it's a great exercise of getting to know. All right. Who else? Any other questions? Sharon Cohen, is a smoke having an impact on the taste of the grapes? That's a great question. Everybody's concerned about smoke. So I'm going to give you my smoke taint 101 theory. And smoke taint is still being widely researched. It's very poorly understood and very complex. So smoke can be absorbed to grapes in a few different ways, and it depends on the stage of growth that a vineyard is exposed to. So it could be absorbed through the leaves and travel via photosynthesis to the grapes. It could just be absorbed through the cuticle of the grape and bind up with compounds, and then when you make wine, voila, you've got some interesting characters. Now, what's fascinating is some of the smoke characters, so two of the main compounds that we look at, guaiacol, 4-methyl guaiacol, are naturally found in grape as well. So, and they're also found in barrels. So it's really interesting, like the synergy of these aromas can be a positive thing or it can be a negative thing. And there are actually many more compounds that can cause smoky flavor in wines. What we don't know is what are the exact conditions that inevitably cause smoke taint. So everything from wind to temperature, to the ripeness of the grapes, to how fresh the smoke is. Is it 12-hour smoke? Is it 24-hour smoke? Is it, 60-hour smoke that traveled from a long way away? And those are some of the questions that we don't know. So as of right now, we basically have a very systematic way of starting to look at some of these markers, assessing whether there's any issues. And long story short, it's too soon to know. We're optimistic. For Chimney Rock, our experience in 17 was we had a fire, just like it came down into our property, like to the top of one of our hillsides. A house burned on the hillside. So there was a lot of fresh smoke. It settled here. We only had 2 blocks that year left to pick, but literally the smoke just settled in. And believe it or not, it was actually mild smoke taint that we had, but we decided not to put that in a bottle and we sold it. So it's a really hard thing to predict. So we have a lot of work going on in the valley now to just kind of assess the situation, and you're going to see differences in different EVAs depending on proximity to fires, the way the wind was blowing, the speed at which the wind was blowing. So too early to say. We're all going to remain optimistic at this point, but stay tuned on that. All good? Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure chatting with you guys today. Thank you for joining us again. We will be back sometime soon, but probably on the crush pad. It won't be a formal tasting. It'll be more of a show and tell, like this is what's happening. We may be able to do a vineyard thing. We might be able to do a little vineyard thing. We'll see. But I look forward to post-harvest, so maybe sometime in November, resuming and having a toast with you guys to celebrate the end of harvest. That's always a very celebratory moment. So thank you for joining us, and I wish you the best fall ahead. Cheers.